Marcus Thorne had learned that survival for a black man in white spaces meant understanding one truth: you are always being watched. So when he walked into the Whitmore estate at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, he made himself exactly what they expected: invisible, efficient, unthreatening. The kind of man who cleaned marble floors without leaving footprints on the stone or fingerprints on the memory. The Greenwich mansion sprawled across 18,000 square feet of old money and new paranoia. Marcus counted the cameras during his first walkthrough, a habit formed during 12 years as an accountant, when numbers stuck to his mind like burrs to wool. 52 cameras. Northeast corner of the main foyer, 12 feet high, 40-degree angle covering the grand staircase. Southeast near the kitchen entrance, 8 feet wide, lens-catching service corridors. He catalogued each one without looking up, without giving any indication. He noticed the glass eyes tracking his grey uniform as he pushed the cleaning cart across floors that cost more than his annual salary. The staffing agency had called it a night position. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., $42,000 a year health insurance after 90 days. They didn't mention the cameras. They didn't need to. Marcus had signed the contract in the agency's fluorescent-lit office while his phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor Amara's asleep. Take your time. The neighbor charged $15 an hour to watch a 9-year-old girl who barely needed watching, but single fathers didn't get to negotiate childcare rates in Stamford, Connecticut, where rent consumed $1,350 of his monthly paycheck before he'd bought a single meal. He'd been an accountant once. Grant & Webber, mid-sized firm in Norwalk, the kind of place where they invited you to the holiday party but seated you at the table farthest from management. 12 years of reconciling other people's money, finding discrepancies in spreadsheets, noticing patterns in numbers that told stories the clients didn't want told. He'd been good at it. Photographic memory, his supervisor had written in the annual review 3 months before Jasmine got sick. Exceptional detail retention. Can recall client portfolios from memory with 97% accuracy. The memory hadn't saved his wife. Stage 4 lung cancer, genetic mutation, never smoked a day in her life. 11 months from diagnosis to death, the last 3 in a hospital room that smelled like industrial cleaner and defeat. The medical bills had swallowed their savings, their retirement accounts, their ability to think about anything except the next treatment, the next scan, the next conversation with an oncologist who used words like palliative and comfort care, while Jasmine's hand grew smaller in Marcus's grip. After she died, he couldn't go back to the desk job. Couldn't sit in meetings about quarterly projections while his 3-year-old daughter asked why mommy wasn't coming home. Couldn't pretend the numbers mattered when the only calculation that counted was how many hours until Amara woke up needing breakfast, needing her father to be present instead of shattered. So he'd found work that let him survive on the margins of other people's wealth, work that ended when the sun rose so he could walk his daughter to school and pretend his eyes weren't hollow from sleeping in fragments. The Whitmore estate hummed with the particular silence of houses built to impress rather than shelter. Marcus moved through the main foyer with deliberate care, his mop strokes measured and methodical. The marble gleamed under recessed lighting designed to make visitors feel simultaneously welcome and inadequate. Oil paintings lined the walls, landscapes and portraits in gilded frames, the kind of art that appeared in insurance appraisals rather than living rooms. He cleaned around them without touching the frames, without letting his eyes linger on brushstrokes that cost more than his car. The household manager had conducted his interview, a man named Gerald Brennan, who wore his 60-something years like a badge of institutional knowledge. The kind of employee who'd been with the family long enough to believe the house belonged to him more than to the owner who paid his salary. Gerald had asked 3 questions during the 7-minute interview. Why night shift? Do you have reliable transportation? Can you work without supervision? Marcus had answered each with the minimum words required. Daughter, yes, yes. And waited in silence until Gerald dismissed him with a handshake that felt like a test of grip strength and racial boundary. Now, finishing the foyer, Marcus checked his watch. 11:43. The first night moved slower than he'd expected, each room presenting itself like an exam question. How thoroughly could he clean without appearing to study the valuables? How invisible could he make himself while cameras recorded his every movement? He'd developed a rhythm in previous jobs, a way of working that suggested competence without ambition, diligence without curiosity. In America, a black man's job security often depended on what white people chose not to see. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel and granite, a chef's paradise designed for caterers who arrived in vans and departed before the guests noticed them. Marcus cleaned the industrial refrigerator's exterior, polished the sink until his reflection disappeared in the shine-wiped-down counters that showed no evidence of recent use. The house felt museum-like, preserved rather than inhabited. He wondered who lived here, who chose to surround themselves with beauty so pristine it couldn't be touched. At 2:17 a.m., Marcus took his assigned break in the staff room, a windowless space furnished with a table, 4 chairs, and a coffee machine that looked unused. He ate the sandwich he'd packed at home, turkey and cheese on wheat bread. Same meal he'd eaten for 3 years because consistency meant one less decision in a life crowded with impossible choices. His phone showed a photo of Amara as the lock-screen, gap-toothed smile from 2 years ago when losing baby teeth felt like the worst thing that could happen to a 7-year-old girl. He thought about Rebecca Sullivan during the break, the way grief ambushed him in quiet moments when his mind had nothing to occupy it except memory. Rebecca had been a nurse at Fairfield County Medical Center 8 years ago, an ordinary woman with extraordinary kindness, someone who stayed late during her shift because dying patients shouldn't face the dark alone. She'd taken care of Jasmine those final 3 months, held her hand during pain episodes when morphine took too long to work, talked to her about recipes and weather and television shows, anything to remind Jasmine that a world existed beyond the hospital room's antiseptic walls. Marcus had tried to thank her after Jasmine died. Tried to find her. Write letters. Express gratitude for the gift of knowing his wife hadn't been alone when the end came at 2:47 in the morning while he was 40 minutes away picking up Amara from a neighbor, because single parents don't get to choose when crisis strikes. But Rebecca had transferred to another hospital, and his letters had gone unanswered, lost in the institutional shuffling of forwarding addresses and administrative changes. For 8 years, the thank you had lived in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow and couldn't spit out. At 2:50 a.m., Marcus resumed cleaning. The East Wing corridor stretched ahead, long and shadowed, despite the recessed lighting. He wasn't assigned to this area. His route covered main floors and common spaces, but something pulled him forward. Call it curiosity or instinct, or the particular recklessness of exhaustion. He pushed the cart quietly across hardwood that didn't creak past closed doors that suggested bedrooms or studies or spaces meant for family rather than staff. The portrait stopped him. It hung in a gilded frame at the corridor's end, illuminated by a picture light that turned the painting into a beacon against the dark wood paneling. A woman in her early 60s, silver hair, kind eyes, the sort of face that made you want to confess your troubles because she looked like she'd understand. The nameplate read, Catherine Whitmore, 1962-2023. Marcus stood before the portrait, his cleaning cart forgotten, his breath catching on something he couldn't name. She looked like Rebecca. Not identical, the age was wrong, the hair color different, but the eyes held the same quality of attention, the same warmth that suggested this person saw you as human rather than function. Marcus remembered Rebecca's eyes from those hospital nights, the way she'd looked at Jasmine, like her pain mattered, like her fear deserved witness, like dying didn't make her less worthy of dignity. The words came without permission, a whisper to a painted stranger. Thank you. For people like you. For Rebecca. For making death bearable when nothing else could. He didn't know cameras watched him. Didn't know that 3 floors above, in a monitoring room lined with screens, a woman sat in darkness and rewound the footage of a janitor standing before her mother's portrait, lips moving in prayer or grief or gratitude she couldn't hear. Marcus returned to his assigned route. The rest of the shift passed in mechanical efficiency. Bathrooms, cleaned floors, mopped trash, emptied surfaces, polished. He finished at 6:47, 13 minutes early, and sat in his 12-year-old Honda Civic in the estate's parking area, head bowed, hands resting on the steering wheel. The exhaustion hit him in waves during these moments, the accumulated weight of being 41 and alone, of raising a daughter on a janitor's salary, of carrying grief that had no expiration date. He allowed himself 2 minutes of stillness before starting the engine. Amara would wake at 7:15. He needed to be home to make breakfast, to walk her to school, to pretend he wasn't running on 5 hours of sleep stitched together from fragments. Eleanor Whitmore sat in the monitoring room as dawn filtered through curtains she rarely opened. 52 screens glowed with empty corridors and vacant rooms, the digital record of a house that felt more secure when she could see every corner simultaneously. She'd installed the first cameras 6 months after her mother died, then added more, then upgraded to higher resolution, better audio motion sensors that tracked footsteps across marble floors. Her friends called it paranoid. Her therapist called it maladaptive coping. Elena called it necessary. Catherine Whitmore had died at Fairfield County Medical Center on a March afternoon, while Elena sat in a board meeting downtown, phone silenced, priorities confused. Post-surgical complications, the death certificate read, but Elena had learned the truth through her lawyer's investigation. A nurse had raised concerns about medication dosage. The attending physician had dismissed the warning. Catherine had died because someone in a position of authority chose protocol over caution, chose ego over listening to the person who'd actually bothered to check the charts. If Elena had been paying attention, if she'd answered her phone, if she'd trusted her instinct that something felt wrong when her mother went in for what should have been routine surgery. If. The cameras couldn't stop the past, but they could document the present with enough clarity that she'd never again miss the moment when disaster announced itself. She rewound the footage to 2:53 a.m., watched Marcus Thorne stand before her mother's portrait for the fourth time in 4 nights. His lips moved words too quiet for even the enhanced microphones to capture. Eleanor had reviewed his background check twice since hiring him. 41, widower, single father to a 9-year-old daughter. Previous employment at Grant & Webber, senior accountant, left 3 years ago for reasons the reference wouldn't specify beyond family emergency. 3 years of maintenance and custodial work at various buildings, always night shift, always unremarkable performance reviews. Clean criminal record. No red flags except the question that nagged at Elena's accountant-trained brain. Why would someone with 12 years of accounting experience clean toilets for $42,000 a year? People didn't downgrade their lives without reason. Either Marcus Thorne was running from something, or hiding something, or broken by something too heavy to carry into daylight employment. Eleanor had learned that tragedy came in varieties, that some people responded to loss by building fortresses, while others tore down what remained of their lives and started over in the rubble. She made a note to review more footage to track his patterns, to understand why a janitor visited her mother's portrait each night like a pilgrim seeking absolution. Gerald Brennan arrived at the estate at 7:30, his morning routine unchanged in 6 years of managing the Whitmore household. He reviewed overnight security footage while drinking coffee in the kitchen, a habit formed when the previous owner had employed staff who thought empty houses meant unwatched opportunities. Most nights revealed nothing worth noting, cleaners cleaning guards guarding the mechanical function of maintenance. But this morning, reviewing the East Wing corridor, Gerald paused the playback at 2:53 a.m. Marcus Thorne, en route, standing before Mrs. Whitmore's portrait, talking to himself. Gerald rewound, watched again, forwarded to 2:58 when Thorne finally left. 5 minutes of unauthorized wandering. 5 minutes of behavior that Gerald's 30 years in household management recognized as the first sign of someone who thought rules applied to other people. He'd opposed hiring Thorne from the beginning, though he'd phrased his concerns carefully during the staffing meeting. We don't know him. 3-year gap in professional employment raises questions. References from custodial work, not his accounting background. Gerald had learned to code his objections in language that sounded like due diligence rather than prejudice, though the truth lived somewhere in the space between his words. He believed in order. He believed people had places. He believed that a man who'd been an accountant and ended up pushing a mop had made choices that suggested unreliability. Mrs. Whitmore had approved the hire anyway, her decision-making clouded by grief and the particular inertia that came with having so much money you stopped caring about the small details. But Gerald cared. The small details protected the large investment. The small details prevented the kind of catastrophe that happened when you stopped paying attention. He compiled the footage into a file labeled Thorne, concerning behavior, and saved it to the shared server where Mrs. Whitmore reviewed household reports. Then he sent a text. Morning report ready for your review. Several items require your attention. Marcus picked up Amara from their neighbor's apartment at 7:45, her backpack already packed, her lunch already made, because Barbara charged extra for breakfast. Amara sat quietly during the drive to their own apartment 3 blocks away. Her silence, the kind that came from being 9 and learning that talking about feelings made adults uncomfortable. Their apartment occupied the 2nd floor of a converted house in Stamford's East Side, the kind of neighborhood where working families pretended they weren't one paycheck from eviction. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen barely large enough for the table Marcus had bought at Goodwill. The rent was supposed to be affordable housing, but affordable meant different things depending on whether you were the landlord or the tenant. Amara dropped her backpack by the door, went to her room without being asked. Marcus made scrambled eggs and toast, the breakfast routine they'd developed after Jasmine died, and he'd had to learn cooking from YouTube videos watched at 3 a.m. while Amara slept. She emerged when he called her wearing the same expression she'd worn since kindergarten, when another child asked where her mother was, and she'd learned that dead wasn't an answer people wanted to hear. They ate in silence, broken only by the scrape of forks on plates. Marcus wanted to ask about school, about friends, about whether she was happy or just surviving, but the questions felt too large for a weekday morning when he had 4 hours to sleep before picking her up at 3:30. She spoke first, her voice careful. Dad, can I ask you something? Always, baby. Why do you work at night? So I can make you breakfast and take you to school. So I can be here when you need me. But you're tired. I see you. The observation cut deeper than she knew. 9-year-olds weren't supposed to track their parents' exhaustion, weren't supposed to carry the weight of adult awareness. Marcus set down his fork, met her eyes across the chipped laminate table. "I'm okay, Amara. I promise."
"Are we poor?"
The question hung between them like smoke. Marcus chose his words carefully, aware that honesty and reassurance made uneasy partners. "We have what we need. Emma at school said you clean toilets for rich people. I keep buildings safe and clean. That's honest work. Don't ever be ashamed of honest work. But Emma's dad is a lawyer. Her mum doesn't work. They have a big house, and we have each other. That's bigger." Amara studied him with eyes too old for her face, then nodded and returned to her eggs. Marcus watched her eat, memorizing the moment, the way he'd memorized 1,000 moments since Jasmine died, building a catalogue of his daughter's childhood against the fear that he'd forget how she looked before time changed her into someone he didn't recognize. After breakfast, they walked the 4 blocks to Riverside Elementary, past chain-link fences and corner stores, past houses that had been nice once before the economy decided this neighborhood wasn't worth maintaining. Other parents drove their children in cars that didn't have dents in the rear fender, dropped them off at the circular driveway with hurried goodbyes and afternoon pickup promises. Marcus walked Amara to the entrance, kissed her forehead, watched her disappear into the building with her shoulders slightly hunched, her backpack too heavy, her awareness of class difference growing sharper each year. He returned to the apartment, set an alarm for 2:30 p.m., and slept with the particular desperation of someone who knew sleep was a luxury rationed in 4-hour increments. The alarm woke him from dreams about hospital rooms and portrait galleries, about Jasmine asking where he'd gone, and Rebecca saying she'd stayed late but Marcus had never said thank you. He showered, dressed, arrived at Riverside Elementary at 3:28, 2 minutes before dismissal. Amara emerged with 2 friends who scattered toward waiting cars when they saw Marcus on foot. She didn't mention it. Neither did he. That evening, after homework and dinner and the bedtime routine that had become sacred in its predictability, Marcus sat in the apartment's dim living room and stared at his phone. The Whitmore Foundation website glowed on the screen photos from last year's annual gala, honoring healthcare workers who went above and beyond. He'd found the site 6 months ago, searching Rebecca Sullivan's name in a final, desperate attempt to locate her. The search had led to a group photo from the Foundation's Nursing Excellence Awards, and there in the background, partially obscured by other attendees, stood a woman whose name tag read Rebecca Sullivan, RN, FCMC Oncology. The same Rebecca, the same hospital. 8 years later, she'd been honored at an event hosted by Elena Whitmore, whose foundation celebrated people like the nurse who'd stayed late, who'd held dying hands, who'd made death bearable when nothing else could. The connection felt like providence or coincidence, or the universe's way of suggesting that some thank yous could cross years and find their target through channels that looked like accident but felt like design. Marcus had applied for the Whitmore estate job the next day, not knowing what he'd find, not planning anything except proximity to something connected to Rebecca, to gratitude to the possibility that Eleanor Whitmore's mother had understood what it meant to care for strangers. At 10:30 p.m., he tucked Amara into bed, kissed her forehead, whispered the same words he'd whispered every night since Jasmine died. "I love you, baby girl. You're safe. I'm here." She fell asleep holding the stuffed elephant Jasmine had bought when Amara was 3 before the diagnosis, before death became a word they couldn't avoid. Marcus stood in her doorway for longer than necessary, watching her chest rise and fall, making promises to a sleeping child that he'd be better tomorrow, stronger tomorrow, present tomorrow, in ways that mattered more than being awake. Then he drove to Greenwich to the Whitmore estate, to his second night of cleaning spaces built for people who'd never worried about rent or medical bills, or whether honest work would ever be enough. The pipe burst at 4:18 a.m. on his 12th night, when the temperature outside had dropped to 6 degrees Fahrenheit and the guesthouse plumbing surrendered to physics. Marcus was finishing the main floor when he heard the sound water running where water shouldn't run, the distinct hiss of pressure escaping metal. He abandoned the cleaning cart, followed the sound through the kitchen and out the service entrance, his breath visible in air cold enough to burn his lungs. The exterior pipe had ruptured along a seam, water spraying across frozen ground in an arc that would create ice damage across the walkway, the foundation, the drainage systems that kept the estate's lower grounds from flooding. In this temperature, the water would freeze within minutes, expanding into cracks that would cost $40,000 to repair. More if the foundation shifted. More still if the freeze reached the main house plumbing. Marcus should have called the emergency maintenance service. The number was posted in the staff break room, available 24 hours for exactly this scenario. But the emergency crew operated from Norwalk, 45 minutes away on empty roads, an hour in any traffic. By the time they arrived, the damage would be irreversible. His father had been a building superintendent in Chicago, had taught Marcus maintenance during childhood summers when other kids went to camp, and Marcus learned that knowing how to fix things meant job security in a world that didn't always value black men's college degrees. Marcus knew pipes, knew how to shut off water apply, emergency seals, prevent catastrophe with tools and knowledge and hands that remembered the lessons even when his accounting career had tried to bury them. The problem was access. The tools he needed lived in the supply room behind a door that required a 5-digit code given only to senior household staff. Marcus was a night janitor with 12 days of employment. He had no authorization, no permission, no legitimate reason to know the code. Except he did know it. Had watched Gerald Brennan enter the supply room on his second night, had seen the older man's fingers punch 72649 without hesitation. Marcus's photographic memory had catalogued the sequence automatically, filed it away in the same mental space where he stored client portfolios and Amara's vaccination schedule and the exact measurements of Jasmine's hospital room. Standing in the cold with water spraying across ground that would become ice, Marcus made a calculation. He could follow protocol, call the maintenance service, watch $40,000 of damage accumulate while he waited for authorization. Or he could use knowledge he wasn't supposed to have access, a room he wasn't supposed to enter, and fix the problem before it became a catastrophe. He thought about Amara, about what he taught her through action rather than words. He thought about integrity and protocol and the difference between rules that protected people and rules that protected institutions. Then he walked to the supply room, entered 72649 on the keypad, and stepped inside when the lock disengaged with a soft click. The tools were organized with military precision wrenches, sorted by size sealants, labeled by application, emergency equipment stored in red bins that promised quick access during crisis. Marcus took what he needed: pipe wrench, industrial sealant, emergency shut-off key salt for ice management. He didn't touch anything else. Didn't look at the expensive equipment or the inventory lists or the things that might tempt a man who earned $42,000 a year. The repair took 47 minutes in cold that turned his fingers numb and his breath into ice crystals. He located the emergency shut-off valve his father had taught him, that valves lived in logical places if you understood building design and stopped the water flow. He applied the industrial sealant with steady hands despite the temperature that made the compound stiff and unwilling. He cleared the accumulated ice with salt and manual labor that left him visibly exhausted, shoulders aching, lungs burning from cold air and exertion. When he finished, Marcus stood looking at the repair, his hands shaking from cold and adrenaline and the awareness of what he'd just done. He'd violated protocol, accessed restricted areas, used codes he shouldn't have known. Any of those infractions could cost him his job, could end the fragile stability he'd built for Amara, could prove Gerald Brennan's suspicions correct. But the pipe was fixed. The foundation was saved. The estate was protected from damage that would have taken months to repair. He whispered to the frozen night, his voice too quiet for microphones or witnesses or anyone except himself. Some things have to be done right, even when no one's watching, even when they'll never know. He returned the tools to their exact positions in the supply room, cleaned the floor where his boots had tracked snow, restored everything to the state he'd found it. Then he resumed his normal route as though nothing had happened, mopped the floors he was supposed to mop, emptied the trash he was supposed to empty, finished his shift at 6:53, and drove home with his secret intact. Except it wasn't a secret. Elena Whitmore had watched the entire 47 minutes from her monitoring room, had seen Marcus enter the supply room without authorization, had tracked his movements across cameras that covered every angle of the guest house exterior. She sat in darkness at 7 a.m., rewinding the footage for the 6th time, watching a janitor save $40,000 of her property with skills he wasn't supposed to have and tools he wasn't supposed to access. Gerald Brennan arrived at 7:30, reviewed the overnight footage, and saw what Elena had seen. But where Elena saw competence and initiative, Gerald saw violation and threat. He compiled the video into a file, added it to his growing folder of concerning behavior, and sent another text to Mrs. Whitmore urgent. Need to discuss Mr. Thorne immediately. Elena stood in the monitoring room staring at frozen frames of Marcus's face as he'd looked at the repaired pipe, exhausted and freezing, and utterly unaware that his moment of private integrity had been recorded from 3 angles in high definition. She could fire him. Should fire him according to every protocol and policy that governed household management. He'd accessed restricted areas, violated security procedures, demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative that looked like trust building before it became theft. But she'd also watched him work for 47 minutes in sub-zero temperatures to save her property when he could have called someone else, collected his salary, and let the emergency crew handle the damage. She'd watched him return the tools to their exact positions, clean his tracks, expect nothing in return. She'd watched a man choose what was right over what was safe, choose competence over protocol, choose to do good work even when he believed no one would ever know. She thought about her mother, about Catherine's death at the hands of people who'd chosen protocol over the nurse's warning, who'd valued procedure over patients, who'd followed rules instead of listening to the person who'd actually bothered to check. She thought about cameras and surveillance and the difference between watching and seeing, between recording and understanding. Then she made a decision that would change everything. At 1 p.m, Eleanor called Marcus's cell phone. He answered on the third ring, his voice careful in the way of employees who know that calls from owners rarely bring good news. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Mr. Thorne, I need to see you. Tonight, before your shift begins." "My study, 10:30 p.m. There was a pause. The sound of breathing. The calculation of a man trying to assess threat level from tone alone. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll be there." Eleanor ended the call and returned to the monitoring room, where 52 screens showed empty corridors and vacant rooms and cameras that recorded everything except the truth about people's hearts. Marcus spent the hours before the meeting in a state of controlled panic, the kind that made his hands steady while his mind spiraled through scenarios. He dropped Amara at school with a kiss to her forehead and a promise to be home for dinner, then drove to the public library in Stamford, where he sat in the parking lot and stared at his phone. The text from his neighbor confirmed babysitting for tonight, $15 an hour, payment due in cash. He had $63 in his wallet and $412 in his checking account until Friday's direct deposit. The math worked if he didn't buy groceries until the weekend. The drive home felt longer than usual, traffic conspiring with anxiety to stretch 20 minutes into an hour of speculation about what Eleanor Whitmore wanted to discuss at 10:30 p.m. Marcus had learned during his accounting years that late-night meetings rarely brought good news, that timing itself communicated urgency that suggested either opportunity or termination. He replayed the pipe incident in his mind, cataloguing his decisions, unauthorized code access, restricted area entry violation of every protocol that governed employee behavior in wealthy households where trust came slowly and disappeared instantly. But he'd also saved $40,000 in foundation damage, had demonstrated competence beyond his job description, had shown initiative that any reasonable employer should value. Unless Marcus thought as he pulled into his apartment complex, reasonable had nothing to do with it. Unless a black man accessing restricted areas triggered suspicions that competence couldn't overcome assumptions that lived deeper than logic and expressed themselves through terminations disguised as performance concerns. He climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment, unlocked the door on a space that had never felt like home, because home required permanence, and this was just shelter between paychecks. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen where Jasmine had never cooked because she'd died before they'd moved here. The furniture came from Goodwill and Facebook Marketplace, assembled from other people's discards into something functional enough to support the life he'd built from grief and necessity. Marcus changed into clean clothes, chose the khaki pants and button-down shirt he wore to parent-teacher conferences, wanted to look professional without appearing presumptuous. He made a sandwich he didn't eat, drank water because coffee at 8 p.m. meant insomnia on top of anxiety. His phone showed 5 p.m., 5.5 hours until the meeting, an expanse of time that felt simultaneously infinite and insufficient. Amara's school let out at 3:30. Marcus picked her up with manufactured cheerfulness, listened to her describe a math problem she'd solved and a classmate who'd shared lunch, and the careful navigation of childhood friendships in spaces where economic difference announced itself through branded backpacks and vacation stories. They stopped at the playground on the walk home, Amara running toward swings, while Marcus sat on a bench and pretended his attention wasn't consumed by what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. She played for 40 minutes, her laughter carrying across concrete and wood chips the sound of someone who didn't yet understand that joy was a luxury some families couldn't afford to take for granted. Marcus memorized the moment, the way he'd memorized 1,000 moments since Jasmine died, storing details against future loss, building a catalogue of his daughter's childhood in case circumstance took him away before she was ready. Homework happened at the kitchen table, math problems and vocabulary words, Amara's concentration absolute in the way of children who'd learned that education mattered more when parents couldn't afford to buy success. Marcus helped when she asked, provided guidance without answers, taught her that struggle built understanding better than ease. By 7 p.m. they'd finished shared dinner pasta with jarred sauce, the affordable staple that had sustained them through years when variety meant choosing between grocery store brands. Bath time, story time, bedtime. The rituals that structured their evenings, that provided stability in a life where Marcus's work schedule and Amara's need for routine existed in constant negotiation. He read her 2 chapters from a library book about scientists who discovered patterns in nature, her favorite kind of story because it suggested the world operated on rules that could be learned and understood. She fell asleep, holding her elephant, the stuffed animal Jasmine had bought when Amara was 3, before cancer had transformed their family from complete to fractured. Marcus stood in her doorway, watching her breathe, making promises to a sleeping child that tomorrow he'd still have the job that paid for this apartment and her school supplies, and the future he was trying to build from minimum wage and overtime hours. The neighbor arrived at 10, a woman in her 50s who'd raised 3 kids and understood single parenthood as survival rather than lifestyle choice. Marcus paid her $25 in cash, $15 for babysitting, plus $10 for the last-minute notice money he'd budgeted for Amara's field trip, but would somehow replace before the permission slip was due. 10:30 p.m. arrived with the inevitability of foreclosure notices and medical bills. Marcus parked in the estate's employee area, walked through the service entrance, climbed the back stairs to the second floor where he'd never been authorized to go. Elena Whitmore's study occupied the northwest corner, its double doors closed but not locked. He knocked twice, heard her voice inviting him inside, and stepped into a room that felt like a command center disguised as an office. 3 monitors dominated the desk, each split into quadrants showing different camera feeds. The walls held bookshelves and filing cabinets and a painting of a seascape that probably cost more than Marcus would earn in 5 years. Elena sat behind the desk in a cream sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled back, her expression unreadable in the monitor glow. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Mr. Thorne, sit. We have things to discuss." He sat, keeping his hands visible on his knees, his posture respectful but not servile. The monitors showed empty corridors and the main foyer and the east wing, where Catherine's portrait hung in its frame. Marcus recognized the camera angles from his nightly routes, understood he was seeing the house through the same eyes that had been watching him for 12 nights. Eleanor turned one monitor toward him, pressed play on footage time-stamped 4:18 a.m. Marcus watched himself run toward the guest house, assess the burst pipe, disappear into the supply room. Watched himself work in the cold for 47 minutes, return the tools, walk away, expecting anonymity. The video quality was sharp enough to show the tremor in his hands from cold, the exhaustion in his shoulders, the moment he'd whispered to the night about doing things right. She stopped. The playback. Studied his face with the same attention he'd given spreadsheets when discrepancies told stories clients wanted hidden. "You accessed a restricted area without authorization, used a code you weren't given, violated multiple security protocols. Give me one reason I shouldn't fire you right now." Marcus met her eyes, chose honesty over excuse. "Because I saved you $40,000 in foundation damage. Because the emergency crew was an hour away, and the freeze would have caused structural problems you'd still be repairing in March. Because I know buildings and my father taught me that sometimes protocol matters less than preventing disaster." Elena leaned back, fingers steepled beneath her chin. "How did you get the code? I saw Mr. Brennan enter it. Second night I worked here. I remember numbers. Accountant habit. You remembered a 5-digit code after seeing it once. I remember most things I see. Client portfolios, phone numbers, the license plate of the car that cut me off 6 months ago. My brain stores information whether I want it to or not." She clicked to different footage, this one showing Marcus at Catherine's portrait, his lips moving in conversation with paint and canvas. "And this, every night, for 12 nights. Explain." Marcus felt the weight of the question, understood that his answer would determine whether he kept the job that fed his daughter and paid the rent on their small apartment. He could lie, manufacture a safe explanation, protect himself with the same caution that had kept him employed in spaces where black men were always one mistake from dismissal. Or he could tell the truth and hope that honesty counted for something in a world where it usually didn't. "Your mother's portrait reminds me of someone, a nurse named Rebecca Sullivan. 8 years ago she took care of my wife at Fairfield County Medical Center. Stage 4 lung cancer, 3 months inpatient. Most nurses did their jobs. Rebecca did more." He told her about Jasmine's last months, about the hospital room that became their world, about Rebecca staying after her shift to hold a dying woman's hand and talk about weather and recipes and television shows that existed in the universe beyond pain. Told her about the night he'd had to leave because Amara needed picking up from a neighbor and single fathers didn't get to choose between their dying wives and their living children. Told her about the phone call at 2:47 a.m. Rebecca's voice saying Jasmine wasn't alone, wasn't afraid, had sent her love to Marcus and Amara with her last coherent breath. "I tried to find Rebecca afterward. Thank her. Tell her what her kindness meant. She'd transferred hospitals. My letters never reached her. For 8 years I carried this thank you that had nowhere to go." He explained the foundation gala photo the group shot from last year's Nursing Excellence Awards, Rebecca in the background with her name tag visible to anyone who knew to look. explained, seeing the connection between Rebecca's hospital and Elena's foundation, between the nurse who'd made death bearable and the billionaire who honored people who went above and beyond. 6 months ago, I saw that photo and realized Rebecca had been honored by your foundation, that your mother's charity celebrated people like the woman who stayed late for my wife. So I applied here, not planning anything, just wanting to be close to something connected to gratitude I never got to express. He gestured toward the monitor showing Catherine's portrait. Your mother has the same eyes Rebecca had, the same kindness. So every night I stop and I say thank you. To her, to Rebecca, to people who make dying bearable when nothing else can. The silence stretched long enough for Marcus to hear his own heartbeat, to catalogue the ways this conversation could end his employment and his ability to provide for Amara. Elena's expression remained unreadable, her fingers still beneath her chin, her eyes studying him with an intensity that felt like audit and assessment combined. My mother died because a nurse raised concerns and was ignored. Post-surgical complications that should have been prevented. If the doctor had listened to the person who actually checked the charts, she'd be alive. I was in a board meeting. Phone silenced, priorities confused. Her voice carried the particular flatness of grief that had calcified into rage and then settled into something colder than either. You're here because of a nurse who did listen, who did care, who made one family's tragedy slightly less unbearable. And I installed 52 cameras because I missed my mother's death while I wasn't paying attention. Marcus absorbed the parallel, understood. They were two people shaped by medical failures and the people who'd tried to mitigate them. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Whitmore, and I'm sorry I violated protocol. I understand if you need to terminate my employment. Elena shook her head slowly. I'm not firing you, but I need to know. Are you trustworthy, Mr. Thorne? I'd like to think so, but you have 52 cameras. You don't have to trust. You can watch. I've been watching. I still don't know. What would convince you I don't know if anything can? She turned the monitors back to their normal positions, ending the interview without dismissing him. Marcus stood uncertain whether he'd been judged or simply observed, whether the conversation had been interrogation or something closer to confession. Your shift starts in 28 minutes. I suggest you begin on time. He left the study, descended the back stairs, retrieved his cleaning cart, and started the route that had become familiar in 12 nights. But the work felt different now, weighted with awareness that every movement was being analysed by someone who understood the space between protocol and morality, who'd lost her mother to bureaucratic failure, and now watched the world through cameras that recorded everything except intention. The night passed in careful routine, each task completed with the precision of someone proving worthiness through competence. Marcus finished his shift at 6:53, drove home through dawn light that turned Greenwich's estates into monuments to wealth that existed in a different universe from his Stamford apartment. He arrived as Amara was waking, made breakfast with hands that still remembered the cold from fixing pipes 3 nights ago, walked her to school, and returned home to sleep 4 hours before the cycle began again. Gerald Brennan reviewed the overnight footage at 7:30 a.m. with his usual coffee and his growing catalogue of concerns. He'd been compiling evidence against Marcus Thorne for 2 weeks, building a file that documented unauthorized corridor visits, supply room access behavior, that suggested someone planning something beyond custodial work. This morning he added Elena's private meeting to his list, noted the timestamps, wondered what conversation required summoning a janitor to the owner's study for 43 minutes. He texted Eleanor at 8:15, direct and professional morning update ready. Several items require immediate discussion regarding Mr. Thorne. Her response came 30 minutes later. Your concerns are noted. No action needed at this time. Gerald read the message twice, felt the dismissal, like a door closing on advice he'd given for 6 years without question. He'd managed the Whitmore household since Catherine was alive, had protected the family's interests through staff turnovers and security upgrades, and the paranoia that followed Catherine's death. He knew what threatening behavior looked like, knew the warning signs of employees who tested boundaries before crossing them completely. But Mrs. Whitmore was grieving, making decisions with emotions instead of logic, letting sympathy override the security protocols they'd built together. Gerald had seen this pattern before in other wealthy households where employers confused kindness with wisdom and ended up robbed or worse. He'd worked too hard too long to protect this estate from threats internal and external. He wouldn't stop now just because Elena had decided to trust her feelings over his professional judgment. He began compiling a more comprehensive presentation, one that would force her to see what the cameras showed, but her emotions ignored. Screenshots organized chronologically, annotations highlighting patterns that might seem innocent individually, but formed a concerning narrative when viewed collectively. Off-route visits to the East Wing, unauthorized access to restricted areas, the suspicious timing of his employment application coinciding with foundation events, the convenient story about a dead wife and a grateful quest that explained everything while proving nothing. Gerald knew how these situations developed. An employee established trust through competence and sob stories, learned routines and security protocols, waited for the perfect moment to exploit the access they'd cultivated through apparent integrity. Marcus Thorne was too smart to be just a janitor, too qualified to accept minimum wage without ulterior motives. The man had been an accountant, understood financial systems, knew exactly what information lived in estate offices and foundation records. The dead wife story was probably true. Those details were too easy to verify, but that didn't mean Thorne's intentions were innocent. 3 days passed in careful routine. Marcus completed his shifts with the particular caution of someone who knew he was being watched by multiple parties with different agendas. He cleaned the assigned areas, avoided the East Wing, except when Catherine's portrait called him during his designated break time, went home to Amara, and pretended exhaustion was normal for single fathers who worked overnight and slept in fragments. Each morning brought the same ritual: wake Amara, make breakfast, walk to school, return home to sleep until pickup time. Each afternoon meant homework help and dinner preparation, and the evening routine that culminated in bedtime stories and promises that tomorrow would be better, even when Marcus wasn't sure he believed it himself. The job at the Whitmore estate paid better than previous custodial work, offered benefits he couldn't afford to lose, represented the closest thing to stability he'd achieved since Jasmine's death, had demolished their financial foundation along with their family structure. On Saturday, his usual babysitter called with bad news, delivered apologetically. Family emergency, can't watch Amara tonight, so sorry for the short notice. Marcus scrolled through his contact list, looking for alternatives that didn't exist. His neighbor charged $20 for weekend nights and had mentioned plans to visit her sister in New Haven. The backup sitter he'd used once had moved to Massachusetts. The after-school program was closed. Single parenthood meant juggling solutions until the balls fell and you had to choose between catching your child or your paycheck. He called the staffing agency at 4 p.m., explained the situation, heard the response he'd expected delivered in the sympathetic but firm tone of people who enforced policies without making them 3-day notice required for schedule changes. Tonight counts as voluntary absence, may affect your probationary status. We understand family situations, but clients expect reliability. Marcus ended the call, stared at his phone, calculated how many voluntary absences would trigger termination and how many weeks he could survive unemployed before eviction became inevitable. The math worked out to 0 tolerance and 0 weeks, which meant he needed a solution that didn't involve missing tonight's shift. The next call went to Elena's cell phone, a number he'd been given for emergencies and had never used because the definition of emergency varied depending on whose crisis was being discussed. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the weekend casualness of someone who'd been reading or gardening or doing whatever billionaires did when they weren't watching surveillance footage. Mrs. Whitmore. I apologize for the last-minute notice. My daughter's babysitter cancelled. I have no backup available. I can't work tonight unless I bring her with me. I understand if that's not acceptable. I can try to find coverage, but if I can't, I'll need to use a personal day. The pause lasted long enough for Marcus to draft his resignation in his head, to calculate how many weeks he could survive on savings that didn't exist, to consider whether honesty had just cost him the job he'd been trying so hard to keep. Bring her. I'll arrange things. The relief hit him like warmth after cold, unexpected, and almost painful in its intensity. Thank you. We'll stay out of the way. She's quiet, won't touch anything. I'll make sure she understands this is a workplace, not a playground. 10:30 p.m. is fine. Use the main entrance tonight, not the service door. Marcus arrived at 10:28 with Amara in her favorite dress, the blue one with flowers that Jasmine had bought before the diagnosis, when shopping for children's clothes had been about preferences rather than budget constraints. His daughter gripped his hand in the way that meant she was nervous but trying to be brave, her backpack containing books and colouring supplies, and the stuffed elephant she'd slept with since she was 3. The main entrance opened before Marcus could knock, revealing Elena in casual clothes that made her look younger than 43, less intimidating than she'd seemed behind the desk, with monitors glowing. She looked at Amara with an expression that shifted from businesslike to something gentler, something that suggested she'd forgotten how to interact with children, but remembered it mattered to try. Hi, you must be Amara. Amara pressed closer to Marcus's leg, managed a whispered greeting that barely qualified as audible. Hi, your dad works very hard. I know, there's a library upstairs, books and a comfortable couch. Would you like to see? Marcus started to object, to insist they'd stay in the staff break room where employees belonged, where Amara could colour quietly while he worked, and no one would accuse him of treating the estate like personal space. But Elena was already extending her hand to Amara with the unself-conscious gesture of someone who'd forgotten protocol in favor of human connection. "I'm awake anyway. Come on, Amara, your dad can start his shift." They climbed the main staircase, two figures ascending toward the second floor, while Marcus stood in the foyer trying to process the strangeness of his daughter being led through spaces he cleaned but never inhabited. He wanted to follow, to ensure she was safe, to maintain the control that single parenthood demanded in a world where letting your guard down meant disasters you couldn't prevent. But Elena had given him permission to work, not to supervise, so he retrieved his cleaning cart and began the route, while overhead his daughter discovered rooms that existed in a different economic universe. The library occupied the southwest corner, its walls lined with first editions and leather-bound volumes that Elena had inherited from her mother and rarely read anymore. The furniture had been chosen for comfort rather than display deep chairs, soft lighting windows that overlooked gardens designed by landscape architects who charged more for consultations than most people earned in months. Amara stood in the doorway with wide eyes, taking in more books than she'd seen outside the public library, more wealth concentrated in one room than existed in her entire apartment building. "I've never seen so many. Do you like reading?" "Yes. Dad reads to me every night, even when he's tired, even when he falls asleep in the middle of chapters, and I have to wake him up to finish the story." Eleanor felt something catch in her chest, the way simple statements sometimes carried weight that philosophical observations couldn't touch. She'd been watching Marcus through cameras, analyzing his behavior for signs of threat or deception. But she'd never considered what his life looked like from his daughter's perspective, a father so exhausted he fell asleep mid-sentence, but still showed up every night because the ritual mattered more than his comfort. What does he read? Everything. "Last week we read about butterflies. Did you know monarchs migrate 3,000 miles? They go from Canada to Mexico, following paths their parents flew, even though they've never been there before. Dad says it's like memory without knowing you're remembering. I didn't know that." Amara noticed a photograph on a shelf near the window, a silver frame containing two women, one young and one older, both smiling at the camera with the ease of people who belong together without effort. "Is that your mum?" "Yes. That's Catherine. My mother. She's pretty." "Is she—" "Here." Eleanor sat in the leather chair near the bookshelf, gestured for Amara to join her on the ottoman. The girl settled like a bird on a branch, ready to fly if the moment turned threatening, staying because curiosity outweighed caution. "No. She passed away. 18 months ago." Amara's face showed the recognition of someone who understood loss in vocabulary beyond her years, who'd learned that death was a permanent absence that adults tried to soften with euphemisms, but children experienced as void. "My mum died too, when I was little. I was 3. I don't remember her very much anymore. Just pieces. The way she smelled like vanilla, how she sang when she cooked." "Dad says that's okay, that love doesn't need memory to be real. I'm sorry. 3 is too young to lose a mother. I miss her. But Dad says she's still with us, in memories and in how she loved us and in the things she taught Dad that he teaches me. He says people don't really leave as long as someone remembers them." Elena absorbed the wisdom delivered in a 9-year-old's matter-of-fact tone, recognized the comfort philosophy that Marcus had developed to help his daughter make sense of loss that shouldn't happen to children. "Your dad sounds very wise. He cries sometimes. At night. He thinks I don't hear. But I do. Our apartment is small and walls are thin, and sometimes I wake up and hear him in the living room. He doesn't make noise or anything. But I can tell from how quiet it gets that he's crying the way people cry when they don't want anyone to know." The confession arrived without warning, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone children used when speaking truths adults learn to hide. Eleanor felt the observation settle in her stomach like a stone, recognized the parallel between a 41-year-old man weeping in darkness and a 43-year-old woman watching cameras at 3 a.m. because sleeping meant dreaming, and dreams brought the dead back to life in ways that hurt worse than their absence. "Do you cry?" "Yes. I cry about my mother. About missing her. About all the conversations we'll never have. That's okay. Dad says crying means you loved someone. That if you don't cry, it means you didn't care. He says Mommy would want us to cry sometimes because it proves she mattered." They sat in silence while that wisdom filled the space between them, while Eleanor reconsidered everything she'd assumed about the man who cleaned her floors and grieved at her mother's portrait. She'd been watching him as a potential threat, analyzing his movements for evidence of deception, building a case for suspicion from behavior that could equally suggest loss and loyalty, and the particular courage of showing up every day despite carrying grief that would have broken weaker people. "Can I ask something?" Yes. Why do you have so many cameras? The question arrived with such innocent curiosity that Eleanor almost laughed. 9-year-olds didn't understand surveillance as protection or paranoia as coping mechanism. They just wanted to know why adults made the choices that shaped their worlds. To stay safe. To make sure nothing bad happens without me knowing about it. From what? What are you scared of? Eleanor considered how to explain fear to a child who'd already experienced the worst thing that could happen, losing a parent, and survived it with more grace than most adults managed. From bad things happening. From missing important moments. From not being there when people need me. Did bad things happen before? Is that why you're scared now? Yes. My mother died while I was at work. I wasn't paying attention. If I had been watching more carefully, maybe I would have known something was wrong. Maybe I could have prevented it. Amara absorbed this with the seriousness of someone too young to dismiss fear but old enough to recognize it when adults tried to hide it behind reasonable explanations. Cameras can't stop bad things. They just record them. That's what Dad says. He says cameras show what happened, but people decide what it means. Eleanor stared at the child, felt the observation land with the force of revelation. All her surveillance equipment, all her monitoring and recording and watching, none of it prevented Catherine's death or caught the medical error before it killed someone she loved. The cameras documented tragedy, but couldn't prevent it, showed her what she'd missed, but couldn't restore what was lost. That's very perceptive. Your dad is right about many things. Amara smiled with the gap-toothed pride of children whose parents were their heroes despite human limitations. He tries really hard. Sometimes he gets things wrong, but he always shows up. That's what matters most, he says. Not being perfect, just being present. The girl picked up a book from the nearby table, a collection of nature photography showing butterflies and birds and landscapes untouched by human intervention. She settled into the couch with the comfortable ease of someone who lived in books, when reality proved insufficient, when the world outside required more resilience than a 9-year-old should need. Elena watched her read for several minutes, noticed how Amara's shoulders relaxed as she turned pages, how her expression shifted from nervous visitor to absorbed reader. Then Elena descended to her study, where monitors showed Marcus cleaning the dining room with the same methodical care he'd shown for 2 weeks, his movements efficient and unremarkable, his face showing exhaustion that cameras recorded but couldn't alleviate. She'd been watching him as a suspect, analyzing his actions for evidence of threat or deception, or the warning signs that preceded betrayal. But Amara's presence in the library recontextualized everything. Marcus wasn't just a janitor with suspicious behavior. He was a father who read bedtime stories despite exhaustion, who cried in darkness when he thought no one could hear, who taught his daughter that presence mattered more than perfection and love outlasted memory. At 3 a.m., Marcus climbed to the library to check on Amara, his shift nearly complete, his worry about her safety, finally overriding the boundaries he'd been trying to maintain. She'd fallen asleep on the couch, her book still open on her chest, her elephant clutched in one hand with the fierce grip of children who held onto comfort objects like lifelines. Someone had covered her with a cashmere throw that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, tucked it around her shoulders, with the practiced care of someone who remembered what sleeping children needed. Eleanor sat in the leather chair with a book of her own reading by lamplight in companionable silence with a sleeping child she'd met 4 hours ago. I'm sorry. She shouldn't have fallen asleep here. I should have checked on her sooner. She's remarkable. Smart, perceptive kind. You're raising her well. She's everything I have, everything that matters. She said you cry at night, when you think she can't hear. Marcus felt his face heat with embarrassment, the particular shame of having his grief witnessed and reported by the person he was trying to protect from the full weight of his sorrow. She's not supposed to hear that. I try to wait until she's asleep, until I'm sure she won't know. Grief doesn't have a schedule, Mr. Thorne. It comes when it comes. You can't control it any more than I can control missing my mother. No, you can't. Eleanor closed her book, set it aside with the careful attention of someone who'd been taught that first editions deserved respect. She gave Marcus her full attention in the same way she'd given it during their first conversation in the study, the same intensity she applied to surveillance footage when she was searching for answers cameras couldn't provide. I've been watching you for 2 weeks. Cameras. Every night. Every movement. I know. I counted them the first night. 52 cameras covering my work areas. I knew I was being watched before I ever started cleaning. You don't seem bothered by it. Marcus chose his words carefully, aware that this conversation was determining his future employment and possibly Amara's stability. I'm a black man working in a white billionaire's house. I'd be watched with or without cameras. At least with cameras there's a record, documentation that protects both of us. You get to verify I'm not stealing. I get evidence I did my job correctly if someone decides to accuse me anyway. The statement landed with the weight of experience Marcus had learned to carry silently, the awareness that surveillance meant different things depending on which side of the lens you occupied. Elena had never considered that cameras could be protective for the person being watched, that documentation could serve as alibi against accusations that came without evidence, but arrived with racial assumptions built into their foundation. You watch to feel safe. I'm watched whether I want it or not. Different reasons. Same outcome. We're both trying to control things we can't control. You with cameras, me with caution. Do you resent it? Being watched constantly? No. I understand fear. After Jasmine died, I was terrified. Every small thing felt like disaster waiting. Amara's cough that lasted too long. School bus running late. Stranger at the playground who looked at her wrong. I couldn't control death, but I could control everything else. Or I tried to. Eleanor recognized herself in the description, saw her 52 cameras reflected in Marcus's attempt to manage unmanageable grief through vigilance that exhausted without protecting. Did it work? Could you control enough to feel safe? No. Just made me exhausted. Made Amara anxious. She started asking if I was okay, checking on me instead of me checking on her. 9-year-old worried about her parent. That's backwards. That's when I realized I had to change or I'd break both of us. What changed, I realized? I can't protect her from everything. Can't prevent every bad thing. Can't watch her closely enough to guarantee safety. But I can teach her we're strong enough to handle hard things when they come. Can show her that love means presence, not perfection. Can prove that we survive together even when we're scared. Eleanor looked at the monitors on her desk, visible from the library doorway, their screens showing empty corridors and vacant rooms and spaces she controlled without inhabiting. I installed cameras because my mother died while I wasn't watching. Hospital error. Nurse warned them about medication dosage. Attending physician dismissed her concerns. Mum died because someone in authority chose protocol over caution. I was at work. Phone silenced. Board meeting that felt important. Missed the call from the hospital. Missed everything that mattered. You couldn't have known. Medical errors happen despite families paying attention. That's the problem. I should have known. Should have been watching more carefully. Should have insisted on being there instead of assuming everything would be fine. You can't watch everyone every second. That's not living. That's just surveillance. The distinction cut through Elena's defenses like the clean strike of an accountant finding the error that explained everything. She'd been surveilling life instead of living it, documenting moments instead of experiencing them, building evidence of existence without actually existing in the spaces she monitored. They sat together in the library with Amara, sleeping between them, two grieving people who'd chosen different strategies for managing loss, and arrived at the same exhausted realization that control was an illusion that consumed more than it protected. The following Monday, Gerald Brennan cornered Eleanor in her study with printouts and presentation files and the formal tone he used when wielding institutional knowledge against poor judgment. I've compiled 3 weeks of concerning behavior regarding Mr. Thorne. It's time to terminate his employment before this situation escalates beyond our ability to manage it safely. His evidence included screenshots of Marcus in the East Wing timestamps of the supply room access, still frames from the library showing Amara asleep on the couch. Gerald had annotated each image with observations about protocol violations and security risks, and the dangerous precedent of allowing employees to blur professional boundaries. Unauthorized code access. Off-route visits to areas outside his responsibilities. Suspicious pattern of behavior that suggests planning rather than coincidence. Now, his daughter sleeping in your library, which violates every household policy we've established regarding employee family members on premises. I gave permission for his daughter. His babysitter cancelled. He asked rather than lying or missing his shift. Gerald's expression tightened with the particular frustration of advisors whose counsel gets dismissed by people who should know better, which raises questions about judgment, Mrs. Whitmore. I understand he has a sympathetic story. Dead wife, single father, struggling financially. But we cannot let sympathy override security protocols. Your mother trusted hospital staff, trusted they knew best and would protect her interests. They were wrong. They failed her. If Mr. Thorne is wrong, if this apparent integrity is cover for something worse, you'll ask yourself the same question: why didn't I see it coming? The manipulation was expert targeting Eleanor's trauma with precision that came from 6 years of understanding exactly which wounds hurt deepest. Gerald had been Catherine's household manager before becoming Eleanor's, had witnessed the grief and guilt that followed the medical error, knew how to weaponize Eleanor's fear of missing what mattered. What specifically do you suggest terminate immediately? Tonight. Severance package equivalent to 2 weeks' pay. Clean break with no opportunity for retaliation or claims of wrongful termination.
I'll handle the paperwork.
You don't even need to be present for the conversation. Let me think about this. Give me 24 hours. Gerald leaned forward, his voice dropping to the confidential tone of someone sharing wisdom accumulated through decades of service. Every hour he remains employed is a risk, Mrs. Whitmore. I've managed households for 30 years, worked with dozens of families, hundreds of employees. I know what threatening behavior looks like. This man is too smart to be just a janitor, too qualified to accept this wage without ulterior motives. People like that have agendas that don't reveal themselves until damage is done. The phrase hung in the air. People like that coded language that suggested race without saying it, that implied threat through association rather than evidence. But this time Elena heard it clearly, recognized the prejudice disguised as professional concern, saw Gerald's recommendations for what they were, fear dressed up as wisdom, bias masquerading as caution.
Thank you for your diligence, Gerald. But I've reviewed the same footage you have. I see competence, not conspiracy. Initiative, not threat. A man trying to do good work while managing circumstances that would have broken someone weaker. I've decided Marcus stays. His face registered shock that shifted quickly to barely concealed anger, the affronted expression of someone whose authority had just been challenged by a person he'd been trying to protect. This is a mistake, a serious mistake that you'll regret when something goes wrong. It's my mistake to make. This is my household, my decision. Your concerns are noted, but my answer is final. And when something happens, when he takes advantage of your trust. When you discover too late that I was right, then I'll handle the consequences. But I won't fire someone for being competent while black. I won't punish integrity because it makes you uncomfortable. You're dismissed, Gerald.
He left with his presentation files and his wounded authority, his footsteps heavy on the stairs like a man who'd given advice that deserved better reception than it received. Eleanor sat alone in her study, turned toward the monitors that showed Marcus cleaning the main foyer with the same careful attention he'd shown every night for 3 weeks, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing if she'd land safely or fall forever. She would stop watching and start seeing, would recognize the difference between surveillance and trust, between documentation and faith, between controlling what she could record and accepting what she couldn't prevent. The cameras had shown her Marcus's actions but couldn't reveal his character. They'd documented his movements but couldn't measure his integrity. They'd recorded his behavior but couldn't capture the man who cried at night when he thought his daughter couldn't hear, who taught butterflies and migration and memory to a 9-year-old who'd lost her mother too young. 2 days later, Elena sat in her study long after Marcus's shift had ended, the monitors dark for the first time in 18 months. She'd turned them off deliberately, chosen to exist without documentation, accepted that safety couldn't be purchased through surveillance, no matter how many cameras she installed or how many hours she spent watching recordings of empty rooms. She thought about Rebecca Sullivan, about the nurse who'd made Jasmine's death bearable through simple acts of presence. About Marcus's 8-year search for someone to thank his nightly vigil at Catherine's portrait, his gratitude that had nowhere to go until he'd seen a foundation gala photo and recognized a connection between the kindness he'd received and the charity Eleanor had built. She opened her laptop, navigated to the foundation database, began the search that would take days or weeks but mattered more than efficiency. Rebecca Sullivan had transferred from Fairfield County Medical Center to somewhere in the Boston area. The trail would be in employment records, nursing registries, professional databases that Elena's foundation connections could access with enough patience and determination. She would find Rebecca Sullivan, would reunite Marcus with the woman whose compassion had transformed his wife's dying into something bearable, would create the opportunity for gratitude delayed 8 years to finally reach its intended recipient, would prove that some connections mattered more than surveillance, that some stories deserved completion, despite the cameras that recorded everything except the moments that actually counted. But tomorrow... Tonight she sat in darkness with her monitors off and her cameras recording rooms she wouldn't review, allowing herself to imagine what trust looked like when you chose it deliberately, instead of defaulting to surveillance. The kind of safety that came from connection instead of control, from faith, instead of documentation, from believing that people were who they claimed to be until evidence proved otherwise. The kind her mother would have recognized as worth the risk, even when risk meant accepting what you couldn't prevent or control or watch into submission. The kind that required courage cameras couldn't capture and surveillance couldn't verify, but that mattered more than any documentation could prove. 3 nights after Elena's decision to keep Marcus employed, despite Gerald's objections, the household manager made his final play. He'd spent 6 years protecting the Whitmore estate from threats real and imagined, and he wasn't prepared to watch everything unravel because grief had clouded his employer's judgment. At 2:14 a.m. on a Wednesday, Gerald entered the maintenance room while Marcus was on his scheduled break, removed Catherine's emerald bracelet from the locked drawer in Elena's study where it had sat untouched since the funeral. and placed it carefully inside the cleaning supply cabinet where any reasonable person would conclude a janitor had hidden stolen property. He photographed the bracelet with his phone, documenting the evidence he'd created, then left the maintenance area and returned to his own quarters to wait for morning when he'd discover the theft and force Eleanor to confront what her cameras had been warning her about for weeks. The bracelet was worth $30,000 insured, but irreplaceable, a family heirloom Catherine had worn at her own mother's funeral. Its disappearance would devastate Elena, and its discovery in Marcus Thorne's workspace would prove Gerald had been right about the janitor all along. But Marcus returned from his break 8 minutes early, his internal clock adjusted to maximize efficiency and minimize time away from tasks that needed completing. He entered the maintenance room, noticed immediately that something felt wrong, a scent in the air that didn't belong, a sense of displacement too subtle for most people to detect, but glaring to someone whose survival had depended on recognizing when spaces had been violated. He opened the cleaning supply cabinet to retrieve floor polish and found the emerald bracelet sitting on top of the industrial cleaner, its gold setting catching light that made the green stones glow like accusations. Marcus's first instinct was panic, the kind that came from understanding exactly how this appeared and exactly what consequences would follow for a black man found with a white billionaire's jewelry in his possession. His second instinct was calculation, the accountant's brain that had made him valuable before grief and medical bills had stripped away his professional credibility. Someone had planted this. The only question was who and why and how to prove his innocence before the accusation became conviction. He pulled out his phone, photographed the bracelet from 3 angles, checked the timestamp to document exactly when he'd found it, then called Elena's cell number, despite the hour, and despite knowing that waking a billionaire at 2:29 a.m. ranked among the worst decisions an employee could make. She answered with the groggy confusion of someone who'd finally managed to sleep and resented the interruption. Mr. Thorne. Mrs. Whitmore. I apologize for calling, but I need you to see something, now, before anyone else. It's urgent. The desperation in his voice must have penetrated her sleep, because her response came sharp and alert. Where are you, maintenance room? Ground floor. Please hurry. She arrived 7 minutes later wearing a bathrobe over pajamas, her hair uncombed, her expression shifting from annoyance to confusion when she saw Marcus standing beside the open supply cabinet with his hands visible and his phone displaying photographs of Catherine's bracelet. That's my mother's bracelet. How did it get here? I found it 3 minutes ago. Exactly where I photographed it. I've never seen it before tonight. I called you immediately because I knew how this would look, and I need you to believe I didn't take it. Eleanor stared at the bracelet, at Marcus, at the supply cabinet that should have contained cleaning products and nothing else. Her face showed the calculation of someone trained to analyze financial discrepancies, someone who'd built a fortune by recognizing when numbers told stories that contradicted official narratives. Someone put it here. Someone who wanted me to find it and assume you were stealing. Yes, ma'am. Someone who wanted you to fire me. Someone who's been building a case against me since I started working here. She pulled out her own phone, opened the security app that gave her access to every camera feed in real time and historical playback. Her fingers moved across the screen with the practiced speed of someone who'd spent 18 months watching surveillance footage, scrubbing backward through timestamps until she found what she needed. 2:14 a.m. There, Gerald entering the maintenance room. They watched the playback together, saw Gerald's careful placement of the bracelet, saw him photograph it with his phone, saw him leave with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just solved a problem through means he considered justified. Elena's face hardened into something colder than anger, something that looked like betrayal, calcified into decision. She forwarded the video to her email, saved a backup copy to 3 different cloud services, then turned to Marcus with an expression that suggested she was seeing him clearly for the first time since he'd started working for her. You called me instead of running. You documented everything instead of hiding. You trusted the cameras to show the truth instead of assuming they'd be used against you. Because the truth matters more than protection, Mrs. Whitmore. And because I have a daughter who's watching how I handle hard situations. I can't teach her to run from false accusations. Can't show her that integrity disappears when it becomes inconvenient. Elena looked at him with something that might have been respect, or might have been recognition that courage came in varieties that surveillance couldn't capture. Wait here. This won't take long. She called Gerald at 2:41 a.m., her voice carrying the particular ice of billionaires who'd just discovered betrayal among people they'd trusted with their households and their grief. He arrived within 15 minutes, dressed but disheveled, his expression showing confusion that shifted to calculation when he saw Eleanor standing beside Marcus in the maintenance room. Gerald, why did you place my mother's bracelet in this cabinet at 2:14 this morning? The question landed without preamble or mercy. Gerald's face cycled through denial and offense before settling on righteous justification. I was securing it. Mr. Thorne has access to areas he shouldn't. I wanted to ensure valuable items were protected from potential theft. Eleanor held up her phone, showed him the video of his careful placement, his photograph, his exit. You were framing him. I have it on camera. Multiple angles. Time-stamped. No ambiguity. You planted evidence to destroy an innocent man's employment. Gerald's mask slipped, revealing something uglier underneath the frustration of someone whose advice had been dismissed, whose authority had been questioned, whose certainty about proper order had been challenged by an employer who'd chosen sympathy over sense. You're trusting cameras over me. I've worked for you 6 years for your mother before that. I've protected this household while you've been making emotional decisions about stuff who don't belong here. Explain that. Who doesn't belong? Say what you actually mean, Gerald. Gerald gestured at Marcus with barely concealed contempt, the kind that had been building for weeks behind professional language and coded objections. People like him don't belong in houses like this. He's a janitor with a convenient sob story, and you're falling for it because you're lonely and grieving and not thinking clearly. He was an accountant. Then he failed. He has a sad tale about his dead wife, and suddenly you're inviting his daughter into your library and treating him like family instead of hired help. This is about maintaining standards, about protecting you from making mistakes that could cost you everything. The racism finally arrived, explicit and undeniable, stripped of the coded language Gerald had used for weeks, exposed by stress and anger into its naked truth. Your mother trusted the wrong people and died because of it. Don't make the same error. Don't let this man's race make you overlook obvious warning signs because you're afraid of appearing prejudiced. Eleanor's voice dropped to the dangerous quiet of someone who'd just heard enough to make a permanent decision. My mother died because doctors ignored a nurse's warning, because people in authority dismissed someone who was trying to help. You just tried to destroy an innocent man's life because you decided he didn't belong in a space you think you control. You're fired. Leave now. Gerald stared at her face, flushing with rage and humiliation, and the particular outrage of someone who believed they'd been protecting rather than betraying. You'll regret this. When something happens, when he takes advantage of your misplaced trust, you'll remember I tried to warn you. I tried to protect you from your own poor judgment. The only thing I regret is not seeing you clearly sooner. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and leave the property. I'll have security escort you to ensure nothing else goes missing. She called the night security guard arranged. The escort watched Gerald leave with his dignity in shreds and his certainty shattered. Then she turned to Marcus, who'd stood silent through the confrontation, witnessing his own defense without participating in it. I apologize. For him. For not seeing what he was doing. For letting my fear make me blind to the difference between caution and prejudice. You have nothing to apologize for, Mrs. Whitmore. You believed the evidence instead of assumptions. That's more than most people would have done. More than I expected, honestly. Eleanor looked at the emerald bracelet still sitting in the supply cabinet, her mother's jewelry that Gerald had weaponized against an innocent man because he couldn't accept that integrity mattered more than race or employment status or his personal ideas about proper order. Will you help me return this to where it belongs? And then, if you're willing, help me dismantle a system I built out of fear that's caused more harm than protection. They climbed to Eleanor's study together, 3 a.m. in a house that felt different now that the person who'd been watching had changed. Marcus waited in the doorway while Eleanor placed the bracelet back in the locked drawer, then turned to face him with an expression that suggested she was about to make decisions that 18 months of grief and paranoia would finally allow. I've been sitting in this room for hours most nights, watching monitors. 52 cameras showing me empty corridors and vacant rooms and spaces I control without living in them. She gestured at the screens that currently displayed the maintenance room, the East Wing corridor, the library where Amara had slept days ago. I thought surveillance would keep me safe, thought if I watched everything I could prevent bad things from happening. But the cameras didn't stop my mother from dying, didn't warn me before Gerald planted evidence, didn't tell me you were trustworthy, just showed me you did good work. The difference between those things is everything. What do you want to do? I want to take them down. Most of them. Keep exterior security, the cameras that actually prevent crime, instead of just documenting my paranoia. But not the interior ones. Not the ones in staff areas where people deserve privacy. Not the ones that make this house feel like a prison I've built around myself. I'll help. If you want. I want. They started that same morning after Marcus's shift ended, but before he needed to go home for Amara. Elena had printouts of the camera layout, architectural drawings that showed placement and wiring, and the infrastructure that had turned her home into a surveillance center. They worked methodically. Marcus, using the ladder from the supply room. Elena cataloguing each camera as it came down, serial number, location, installation date, the reasons she'd placed it there in the first place. Camera 18 covered the staff break room. Marcus stood on the ladder disconnecting wires while Elena held the base steady. No one should be watched while eating lunch, while taking a break from work that's already exhausting without adding the stress of constant observation. I was afraid they'd steal food, supplies, the small things that add up over time and months and years. Most people just wanted to rest without feeling judged, wanted 15 minutes where they could be human instead of employee. The camera came free. Marcus handed it down. Elena placed it in the box they'd labelled for storage. Camera 23 watched the East Wing corridor where he'd visited Catherine's portrait every night for 3 weeks. This one caught you talking to my mother. Caught me watching you talk to her. Neither of us knowing the other was grieving the same way. Did it bother you, seeing me there every night at first? Then I realized you were doing what I was doing, just with different rituals, different ways of saying goodbye to people who left too soon. Camera 31 had documented Gerald's evidence, planting the only surveillance that had mattered in the end. Marcus removed it with particular care, handed it to Elena like evidence in a trial that had already reached its verdict. This one showed the truth when it counted. Only because I chose to look at what it was actually showing instead of what I expected to see. Cameras are just tools. They don't interpret themselves. People decide what images mean. They worked through dawn and into morning, removing cameras from bedrooms and bathrooms and corridors, keeping only the ones that covered genuine security concerns, exterior perimeters, main entrance, the climate-controlled storage where Catherine's art collection required protection from temperature fluctuation and actual thieves. 52 cameras became 16 surveillance, became security, paranoia transformed into reasonable caution. At 8:30 a.m. they finished standing in Elena's study, surrounded by boxes of dismantled equipment. Marcus looked exhausted in the way people did after night shifts extended into morning, but his expression showed something like satisfaction mixed with relief. How do you feel? Terrified and free. Those shouldn't go together, but they do. Like stepping off a cliff and discovering I can fly, or at least that falling doesn't kill you immediately. That's called being alive instead of just existing. That's what my daughter would say anyway. She's wiser than both of us combined. 6 months transformed the Whitmore estate from museum into something approaching home. Marcus accepted Elena's offer to become Director of Household Operations at $82,000 a year, with benefits that included health insurance and education assistance, and the kind of job security that let him sleep more than 5 hours at a stretch. His first act was establishing a scholarship fund for all household staff children, not just Amara, 7 kids total, whose parents worked as groundskeepers and cooks and maintenance staff and deserved the same opportunities wealthy families took for granted. His second act was implementing family emergency policies that meant no one had to choose between their job and their child's illness, between their paycheck and their parents' surgery, between stability and crisis. People worked better when they weren't terrified, he'd told Elena during the policy review. Loyalty came from being treated like humans instead of functions, from knowing that employers cared about their lives beyond the hours they clocked. Amara transferred to a private school in Greenwich, where the scholarship covered 60% of tuition, and Marcus's salary covered the rest. She thrived in classrooms where teachers had time to notice individual students, where math club met twice a week instead of never, where the other children's parents worked in finance and law. But at least some of them had parents who remembered what struggle looked like. When people asked what her father did, she answered with pride. He makes sure people are treated fairly. He helps families. Eleanor's transformation happened more slowly but with equal thoroughness. She hired a therapist who specialized in grief and control issues, attended sessions twice a week, learned to sit with discomfort instead of surveilling it into submission. She sold her majority stake in the private equity firm she'd built before Catherine died, kept a board position, but stepped away from the day-to-day management that had consumed her attention while her mother had been dying in a hospital 40 minutes away. The foundation became her focus, the nursing excellence programs and healthcare worker support and patient advocacy that honored Catherine's memory through action instead of cameras. In March, 6 months after Gerald's termination and Marcus's promotion, Elena sat in her study with a task that felt simultaneously simple and monumental. She opened her laptop, navigated to the Foundation database, began the search she'd been planning since the night she'd turned off the monitors and chosen trust over surveillance. Rebecca Sullivan, nurse. Last known employment, Fairfield County Medical Center, transferred 8 years ago to somewhere in the Boston area. The trail required patience and Foundation connections, and the kind of determination that came from understanding that some stories deserved completion despite years of delay. She started with nursing registries, professional databases that tracked certifications and employment history. Rebecca Sullivan appeared in dozens of search results. The name was common enough to require careful filtering by age, location, specialization. Elena cross-referenced with Fairfield County Medical Center employment records from 8 years ago, narrowed the list to 3 possibilities, began making phone calls. The first, Rebecca Sullivan, worked in pediatrics in Worcester, had never been to Fairfield County. The second was retired in Florida, too old to match Marcus's description. The third worked at Boston General Hospital in oncology, had transferred from Connecticut years ago, matched the timeline perfectly. Eleanor called the hospital, asked for the nursing supervisor, explained she was calling from the Catherine Whitmore Foundation regarding a former Fairfield County Medical Center nurse who'd been nominated for recognition. The supervisor confirmed Rebecca Sullivan still worked there, still did extra shifts, still stayed late for patients who needed someone present during the hardest moments. She made the call to Rebecca's direct line on a Tuesday afternoon, her heart beating faster than professional conversations normally warranted. Ms. Sullivan. My name is Elena Whitmore. I run the Catherine Whitmore Foundation, which honors healthcare workers who demonstrate extraordinary compassion. I'm calling about a patient you cared for 8 years ago at Fairfield County Medical Center, Jasmine Thorne. The pause on the other end held weight, memory surfacing through years of patience and exhaustion, and people Rebecca had tried to help, despite systems that made helping harder than it should be. Jasmine. Yes, I remember her. She had such strength, such love for her family. Is everything all right? Has something happened? Her husband Marcus has been trying to find you for 8 years. To thank you for staying with his wife, for making her final months bearable. He works for me now. I'd like to reunite you if you're willing, to give him the chance to express gratitude that's been waiting all this time. Rebecca's voice caught with emotion that professional distance couldn't quite mask. I would be honored. Jasmine talked about Marcus and their daughter every single day, about the life they'd built together, about how much she wanted to see her daughter grow up. I've thought of her often over the years, wondered about her family. Eleanor explained about the Foundation's annual Nursing Excellence Gala in April, about the Jasmine Thorne Memorial Scholarship she was establishing, about Rebecca's role in directing the program if she was interested in relocating to Connecticut, about Marcus and Amara and the years they'd carried gratitude that deserved acknowledgement. The gala occupied the ballroom of a Hartford hotel in late April, 200 guests in evening wear, celebrating nurses who stayed late, and doctors who listened, and healthcare workers who remembered that patients were humans instead of cases. Marcus arrived in a suit he'd bought specifically for this occasion, Amara in a blue dress that made her look older than 9. Both of them nervous, in the way people were nervous when something important was about to happen and they couldn't control the outcome. Eleanor met them at the entrance, looking elegant in a black gown that suggested mourning transformed into purpose. She's here. Rebecca. I haven't told her exactly how the evening will unfold. I thought you should have that moment privately before the formal recognition. Marcus gripped Amara's hand, followed Elena through the ballroom to a quiet corner where a woman in her late 30s stood holding a glass of wine and looking slightly overwhelmed by the formal attention. She had kind eyes, Marcus noticed immediately. The same warmth he'd remembered from 8 years ago when she'd held Jasmine's hand and made dying bearable. Rebecca Sullivan. This is Marcus Thorne, and his daughter Amara. Rebecca's face showed confusion that shifted to recognition that brought tears before words, understanding arriving in the space between introduction and comprehension. Marcus, Jasmine's husband. You found me. The past 8 years collapsed into the present grief and gratitude, mixing into something that felt like completion. Marcus's voice broke when he spoke. You took care of my wife when she was dying. You stayed late during your shifts, held her hand when pain was unbearable, made her last months bearable when everything else was falling apart. She was remarkable, so full of love for you and Amara. She talked about you both constantly, about the life you'd built together, the future she wanted for Amara, even though she knew she wouldn't see it. I looked for you after she died, wanted to thank you for being there when I couldn't, for calling me that night, for telling me she wasn't alone, wasn't afraid. That gift was everything to me, everything to us. Rebecca wiped tears with the back of her hand, professional composure dissolving into the honest emotion of someone who'd comforted hundreds of families, but rarely received comfort herself. I think of her, of all the patients I've lost. I hope I gave her some peace, some dignity in those final days. You gave her everything. You made death bearable when nothing else could. You let her die knowing someone cared enough to stay. Amara tugged Marcus's sleeve, her voice small but steady, in the way of children who'd learned to navigate adult emotions too young. Dad, who is this Marcus, knelt to her eye level, his hands on her shoulders. This is Rebecca. She took care of Mummy when Mummy was sick. She was there with Mummy at the end when I couldn't be. She made sure Mummy wasn't alone. Amara studied Rebecca with the serious attention of children evaluating adults who'd intersected with their lost parents, who carried memories that children were too young to have formed themselves. Thank you for being nice to my mum, for staying with her. Rebecca knelt too, bringing herself to Amara's height, her voice gentle with the practiced kindness of someone who'd spent a career helping families through impossible situations. Your mum loved you so much. Every single day she told me about you. About your laugh, about how smart you were, about the butterflies you loved. She wanted you to know she'd always be with you even after she was gone. Do you really remember her? I was only 3. I don't remember much anymore. I remember her very clearly, and I'd be happy to share those memories with you, to tell you about the mother who loved you more than anything in the world. The 3 of them stood together in the corner of the ballroom while the gala continued around them, a moment of connection that cameras couldn't capture and documentation couldn't preserve, but that mattered more than any surveillance could verify. Elena watched from a distance, understanding that some things required witness but not participation, that her role was creating the space where gratitude could finally find its voice after 8 years of searching. Later that evening, after Rebecca had been formally honored with the Jasmine Thorne Memorial Nursing Excellence Award, and Marcus had given a brief speech about compassion that transformed tragedy into bearable grief, Eleanor announced the scholarship program. $50,000 annually for nurses who demonstrated extraordinary care, who stayed late for scared patients who remembered that healthcare was about humans, not just healing. Rebecca would direct the program at a salary of $110,000, relocating from Boston to Connecticut to oversee the foundation's nursing initiatives and ensure that people like her, people who made death bearable, received recognition beyond exhaustion and moral satisfaction. 3 months after the gala, on a Sunday afternoon in July, when summer heat made the gardens shimmer, Elena hosted a barbecue at the Whitmore estate. Not a formal event, not a foundation fundraiser, just people gathering because company was pleasant, and the house that had felt like a museum was finally becoming a home where laughter was welcome. Marcus stood at the grill, teaching Elena the difference between medium rare and medium, while she laughed at her own incompetence with anything that required timing instead of money. Amara ran through the garden with 3 friends from school, their laughter carrying across lawns that had been designed for photographs instead of children. Rebecca helped set the table, arranging plates with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent careers making order from chaos. The estate staff came as friends instead of employees. The head gardener who'd worked for Catherine, the chef, who still couldn't believe Elena ate takeout most nights, the housekeeper who remembered the surveillance months as a time when the house felt haunted by someone living. They ate together without hierarchy, without the careful distance that separated employers from employed, without cameras documenting every interaction. Mid-afternoon, Amara approached Elena with the combination of curiosity and mischief that 9-year-olds wore when they wanted to know things adults tried to hide. Ms. Elena, Dad told me you used to have cameras everywhere. Can I see them? Like a museum of watching. Eleanor looked at Marcus, who shrugged with the expression of parents who'd learned that children's questions deserved honest answers, even when honesty was complicated. Sure. Let me show you something about being afraid and learning not to be. They walked to the storage shed at the garden's edge, opened the door on boxes of dismantled surveillance equipment, gathering dust in the summer heat. 36 cameras that had once formed a web of watchfulness now sat in storage, their lenses dark, their recordings stopped their purpose, obsolete. Why'd you need so many, I was afraid. Thought if I watched everything I could stop bad things from happening. Thought surveillance meant safety. Did it work? No. It just meant I was watching instead of living, recording instead of experiencing, controlling instead of trusting. Amara examined a camera with the same attention she gave butterflies in the garden, turning it over, studying its construction with the scientific curiosity of someone who wanted to understand how things worked. My teacher says you can't control everything. You can only control how you react. Dad says the same thing, that we're strong enough to handle hard things together. Your teacher and your dad are both very wise. That's exactly what I had to learn. That cameras show what happened, but people decide what it means. That trust matters more than surveillance. They returned the camera to its box, closed. The shed walked back toward the garden where people were eating and talking and existing together without documentation. A monarch butterfly landed on Amara's shoulder, its orange and black wings vivid against her blue dress. Everyone stopped talking, watched the moment unfold with the reverence people gave to beauty that wouldn't last. Amara stood perfectly still, barely breathing, her eyes wide with wonder and awareness that the butterfly would fly if she moved wrong. The butterfly stayed for nearly a minute, wings opening and closing in the rhythm of something alive and present and utterly indifferent to being watched or documented or controlled. Then it flew away, disappearing into flowers and leaves and spaces where cameras couldn't follow. Did everyone see? Yes, sweetheart. We all saw. It was beautiful. And now it's a memory. That's better than a photograph, Dad says, because memories are alive and photographs are just frozen. She ran back to her friends, leaving the adults to their conversations and their comfortable silence, and the particular peace that came from choosing presence over documentation. Eleanor and Marcus sat on the porch steps, watching the garden fill with golden light of late afternoon. The Whitmore estate spread around them 18,000 square feet that felt smaller now that people actually lived in it, instead of just maintaining its perfection. Thank you, Marcus, for being honest when it was dangerous, for showing me what trust looks like when you choose it deliberately. Thank you for listening, for choosing what's right over what's safe, for giving Amara and me a chance when most people wouldn't have. Rebecca joined them on the steps, her wine glass empty, her expression content in the way people looked when they'd found purpose that aligned with values. This is lovely. All of it. The scholarship, the foundation work, this gathering. Catherine would have loved it, would have recognized herself in the kindness you're building. Elena felt the familiar ache of missing her mother, but it felt different now, softer, more like memory than wound. She would have seen all of you clearly from the beginning, would have known Marcus was trustworthy, would have recognized Rebecca's compassion, would have understood that cameras couldn't protect her from death, but connection could make life worth living. They sat together watching fireflies begin their evening dance, watching Amara and her friends run through grass that had been manicured for photographs, but now held actual footprints and laughter and the evidence of children who weren't afraid to leave marks on perfection. Eleanor thought about the monitoring room upstairs, now repurposed as a reading space, with comfortable chairs and windows that let in natural light instead of the glow from screens showing empty corridors. Thought about the 16 cameras that remained, all pointing outward at genuine security concerns instead of inward at people who deserved privacy and trust. Thought about her mother's portrait in the East Wing, no longer watched by lenses, but visited sometimes when Elena needed to remember that kindness mattered more than control. Tomorrow, Marcus would present new staff development initiatives to the household team. Rebecca would launch the mentorship program, pairing experienced nurses with new graduates who needed guidance navigating systems that prioritized efficiency over compassion. Amara would bring her math club to study butterfly migration patterns in the garden, turning the estate's beauty into education instead of just decoration. And Elena would simply be present for all of it, not watching through screens but seeing with eyes that had finally learned the difference. The fireflies danced in darkness that cameras had once tried to illuminate and control, making their own light through chemistry and instinct and the particular magic of things that lived without needing documentation or permission or surveillance to validate their existence. She'd spent 18 months building a fortress of cameras against a world that had taken her mother. But in the end, what had saved her wasn't watching everything. It was choosing to see the one thing that mattered, that integrity, love, and the quiet courage of doing right when no one's watching could only be witnessed by hearts brave enough to trust what cameras could never capture.